Martin, do you think governments are adopting the correct model?
I think when you look around Europe, it's quite different depending on where you go. It's very easy for us sitting here doing this interview in London and talking about public-private partnerships and privatisations and all those sort of things. Certainly, our investment in Thames Water, we're going to be spending £1 billion a year on capital just to keep the infrastructure going. And the idea that the government could do that is clearly not sensible. But if you were to have the same conversation in Paris or in Frankfurt, it's a very different conversation you end up having, and a lot of it is down to the liberal attitude that the UK government has had to letting go of some of these essential service assets. And I had a conversation the other week with some people in Frankfurt, and they were saying you shouldn't really be using the UK as an example for what we're trying to do in Europe, because actually quite a lot of people within Europe will see the UK as quite a bad example of the privatisation of infrastructure and the management of infrastructure. And I think a lot of it is down to actual trust that people can have that the private sector is going to be capable of actually managing some of these really essential service infrastructure assets well. And that's not just about how much you pay for them or what promises you give. It's basically about delivery and track record, and are you actually going to make sure these services are kept up to scratch. And I think that's going to take a long time for the sort of things that happen in the UK to transfer into the European market. Quite interesting to hear what Olivia has to say about that.
I mean, to a certain extent, what you describe is the positive way for the government to approach it, right? Make sure that the service will be delivered. There is also a lot of political sensitivities. I mean, US is a good example where some governments or local governments were thinking about selling assets to the private market. But on the other hand, we're concerned that, toll roads mainly, that the rates may escalate too quickly, and then the voters would perceive that there is double taxation and they pay for a service they should have for free, almost for free. But on the other hand, the public sector is willing, in this case, to maximize the initial proceeds when they sell such an asset. But they would like as well to cap the tariff and the rate of growth of this tariff. So there is a bargain there. And to me, the interest for the public sector should be, value for money, better efficiency, rather than getting the largest possible amount of money they want to drop into pension. So there is this. The politicians are, the governors are keen, basically in the US, getting the money, but the politicians are not keen getting the voters, upset with the increase in rate. So there is a bit of, catch-22 there. So it's an issue, and it's really a political willingness to say, there is a reason why users should pay for this service, and then, but you can regulate the rate and control that. So.
That's where the Bliss theory of infrastructure comes in, you see. Because the Bliss theory of infrastructure is that it shouldn't be, the politicians shouldn't be responsible for infrastructure as such, but the Cardinal of Westminster and the Archbishop of Canterbury should be responsible for infrastructure, because they can take almost a religious timeline, a long distance view, and just gradual investment over time, very little change in the strategy, as it were, but just a definite strategy, long-term investment. No thinking about what the headlines will be tomorrow, but just long and gradual, and that's effectively what infrastructure assets require. They don't really. The US has been an amazing example of what happens when you hand over infrastructure to political control. You have to look and see what happens in Texas, where they got very concerned that their roads would be being run by, oh my God, people that weren't built and operated by people that weren't just American, and suspended the process for a year or two. And I know that's the federal government, gave the Texas legislature or the Texas Road Authority a slap over the wrists about it, but it shows the unpredictability in apparently the most developed market economy in the world in infrastructure strategy.
I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that public-private partnerships have been successful. I mean, we were talking about it either in the public sector or in the private sector. And I think the UK model has actually recognised that both parties have a role to play. So certain things such as building roads, building hospitals, building schools, the actual bricks and mortar or tarmac can be done by the private sector very effectively. But that isn't, we talked about essential service assets. The essential service has often been retained in the public sector. So the provision of healthcare, the provision of education, those types of things have been retained in the public sector. And it's not just about whether it's politicians or the Archbishop of Canterbury, it's also about what the electorate want. And I think, within the UK, and I'm focusing my comments on the UK, people want the health service to be provided by government. And I think that's why there is a model that allows actually the hard assets. The government shouldn't be in the business of building hospitals, but it should be in the business of providing healthcare, and that's why there is a model that I think recognises both.
It's much more neutral though, because at the end of the day, the citizen will not really perceive the difference in cost between having PFI or pure public procurement. So whereby for user-paid services, then there could be a difference. So I think this is where the political sensitivity is more than for the social infrastructure.
But I think that the PPP model of making the procurement of big assets as on a sort of a long-term basis is exactly as the Bliss model of removing politics from procurement is a huge benefit that the PPP is run. And for me, when I'm doing the government side advisory, one of the biggest benefits I see is right at the outset, which is forcing governments to be absolutely precise what it is they want to buy, deciding that and maybe spending several months deciding that, and then sticking to it, rather than an old traditional procurement which was changing their mind halfway through, which was the classic way of leading to cost and time overrun. So the discipline of really thinking of what public service you want, and in particular what underlying assets you need, is one of the huge drivers of value of PPPs, and it effectively hands that debate, once it's decided, over to procurement experts and private sector people with experts to deliver. And then, once you've actually created those underlying services and assets, as Andy said, the day-to-day delivery, whether or not that's selling tube tickets or the actual treatment of patients or teaching of children, is left where political control is more relevant and needs to be more immediate.
Martin, do you find governments easy to deal with? And do you think they should be releasing more assets
And you're on tape.
for investment?
Governments are... if you want to get involved in infrastructure and you want to buy infrastructure assets around Europe, you have to be good at dealing with governments. And the problem with governments is that governments often change, and that results in there being a little bit of instability in decision making. A great example of that is the Dutch market. The Dutch went through a process of trying to force electricity and gas companies to unbundle their distribution systems from the merchant energy activities, and they went through a whole period of discussion, which was trying to pass legislation through Parliament to get that in place. At the point that the legislation was going through Parliament, the government changed, and that's a process that went on for over 2 years of debate. So everyone gets geared up to go through that, and then suddenly this happens. And then there's now another debate about it going on in Holland. So in order to participate in these markets, you've got to take a long-term view. You've got to be patient. You've got to understand that actually governments are going to change and policy is going to change. But at the end of the day, there is a certain inevitability about all of this stuff, which comes back to this OECD report, that governments cannot afford to fund all of this infrastructure, that, as you rightly say, the way that they can recycle capital is by selling existing assets and recycling it into new stuff, or getting the private sector to invest. And so you're going to see these short-term problems with politicians. You're going to see short-term fluctuations in policy. But over the next 10, 15, 20 years, I think across Europe there will be a huge swathe of infrastructure that will be available for private investors to invest in. It just means that you have to be very patient, and you have to take a long-term view of all of this.
Well, yeah, and one of the things, if you're a banker or a project sponsor trying to decide which projects to go for, Politics changes, but what you need to look at is that fundamental need. Is it so obvious that the need is so overwhelming that the project is likely to go ahead irrespective of political changes? Is there a need for a particular hospital in an area or a road because it's so clearly congested? And if the answer to that is yes, the likelihood is in some shape or form the project will keep going, despite sort of political shenanigans on the way. So that's the key question, and as long as you've got that confidence and there's general support for the project, it's probably going to proceed.